Hello everyone, this is David for chesslessons.com, and today we're going to be going over the game of Fransiss21 rated 1212 versus wrthjke rated 1186, and we're going to look at this game from the perspective of the black pieces. And this tournament took place yesterday on Lichess. It was an under 1300, very fast 3-0 tournament. And let's take a look at what happened. So the game started off with a French defense, and we went into an exchange variation that's known to be quiet and drawish, but there are still a lot of tricks from both sides. So white strikes out with knight c3, which I don't think it's in the spirit of this opening because black can easily respond with something like c6 defending this pawn or knight f6. And it doesn't really put a lot of emphasis on getting his king to safety, maybe with a move like bishop to e3 or knight to f3. So I don't really like this move so much for white. I guess white attacks this pawn, black defends the pawn, and he immediately pins the knight. This pawn is defended 2 times, and what you could do in this position maybe is break the pin with bishop to e7, preparing to castle. So you played knight to c6. Another idea is maybe pinning his knight to relieve some stress from d5. Okay, you played knight to c6, and your opponent developed his piece, his knight to f3, bishop e7, bishop to b5, and here you have to be aware that this knight is not the greatest defender of this pawn because at any moment he can strike and take it. And secondly, your next move, bishop d7, like this queen is also a second guard for this pawn. So you have to be really careful. And earlier in the game, the question arises here in this position. Does the tactic of removing the guard work here after, let's say, after knight c6? Can your opponent simply take this knight, and if you take with the queen, capture a free pawn? Does that work? Or does he force you to get double pawns? So in this case, the removal of the guard doesn't work because after queen takes and knight takes d5, you have this trick with queen to d6, attacking this knight, and if he moves it, you can just recapture maybe with the knight. Now, the question I have now, which I just thought of, is, well, what about c4? Can't he just solidify his knight with c4 and keep the pawn? And I'm thinking maybe a move like bishop to e6 would actually help you in this case because your opponent is very far away from castling. You can castle on your next move and build more pressure in the center. And your opponent can't castle long because, all his pawns are removed. There's not a lot of defense over there if he castles long, and it's going to take him quite a while. Go back, knight to c6. So this was the first, I would say, major mistake of the game. Bishop to d7. I don't think your opponent caught that. Let's see. Yeah, he didn't catch that. He could have just removed the guard, which is the knight guarding the pawn, and captured this pawn for free with no consequences and just been up a whole pawn. So instead, your opponent castled, you castled, and your opponent, I would say, is being a little bit too aggressive. Just jumping into e5, it's a little bit too soon to go out on this attacking spree. So you take, and then he makes a pretty big mistake of capturing your bishop. And here you have a tactic called the Boomerang Tactic, as I've mentioned in the notes here, where you could just jump back, save your knight, and basically there's a saying in chess of he who takes first and takes last takes best. So you took first, he took second, and now you could be taking last and getting your knight away to safety. So when you want to ask yourself, how do I want to recapture a piece? You should generally recapture a piece with a piece that's being attacked, or what they call en prize, or up for the taking. So your queen's not being attacked, it's not en prize, but your knight is. So by taking the bishop, recapturing the bishop with your knight, you're just going up an entire piece. He took with the queen, he recaptured. You guys trade off a few pieces, and here we have another very important lesson. So after you recapture this pawn, you have to understand that this is a central pawn, and it's very advanced up the board. It's on, from your perspective, it's on 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th rank. So it's getting closer and closer to queening. Versus this pawn is on the 2nd rank, right? And it's not a central pawn. So 1, wing pawns are not as effective as central pawns. 2, an advanced pawn on the 5th rank is worth more than a pawn on the 2nd rank. So your next move, where you played queen takes b2, I don't like this move. I think you could have played f5, and that would have been dual purpose. 1, it would have solidified your central pawn. 2, it would have prevented any back rank problems later on. As we'll see, the back rank problems are what essentially cost you the game at the end. So after you take the pawn, the game's pretty even here. I would say, white has drawing chances, even though he's down 1 pawn. It's not decisive by any means. And in this position, when you have these rooks and queens in more or less an endgame, what you want to do is called making luft, or basically creating a hole for your king, so to avoid a lot of tactics and back rank problems. So you could play a move like h6 or g6, and then that'll give your king an escape square, like either this way or g6 this way. So instead you blunder a rook, which is not so obvious because king takes, rook takes his mate. And I'm not sure if you considered this, even though it doesn't work. A saving grace here might be if your opponent is not so tactically inclined to play this intermezzo move, queen takes a1. And if he makes the mistake of automatically recapturing without thinking much, you can get back in the game. Now, if your opponent is tactically inclined and sharp, he'll see that he doesn't need to recapture that queen right away, that he can first capture your rook with check, and then after you recapture his queen, he can be up a whole entire rook and win the endgame. So maybe for practical chances to hold the game, your move might even be a little bit better because it keeps pieces on the board, and generally you don't want to play for tricks. And when you're down material, like in this case, you're down rook, you don't want to play hope chess, like taking a piece, hoping for him to blunder. And I think this is a good stopping point here because we learned 5 important lessons from this game. We'll go back and just go over them very quickly. One is the boomerang, which is basically he who takes first and takes last takes best. You took, he took. Now what you want to do is boomerang back and recapture with your knight. The second thing is you don't want to leave your central pawns hanging. So be aware after this pin that maybe what you wanted to do instead of bishop to e7 is pin his knight so that it relieves some stress on d4. When you put your pawns in the center, that's a good thing. What you want to do is you want to control central squares with your pawns. But what you want to also be aware of is once you put pawns in your center, they put some pressure on the pieces that are defending them. So in this case, the knight and the queen are defending this pawn, and you don't want to create a blockage from your queen to your pawn. And I understand you didn't want to double your pieces, but just remember, bishops are better than knights in most cases. And if he wants to exchange his bishop for a knight, you don't have to worry about that too much. And finally, I think a very good important learning lesson from this game was the central pawn that's advanced in the board is worth more than a wing pawn that's sitting on its home square. And a move like f5 would have been dual purpose. One, it solidifies